right. Okay, we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to the intro session to the Cloud App Model for Office and SharePoint. This is a two-part session. We're going to spend the first hour talking about the core concepts and focus more on apps for Office. And we're going to have a second session after this one that will focus a little bit more on apps for SharePoint. And as you will see, the model is the same model across the board, so all these concepts are useful anyway. So my name is Rolando Jimenez, and I'm a program manager on the Office Solutions Framework team, which is a team that owns programmability within Office. And this time, in 2013, we made a lot of investments to create this new cloud app model, which we're going to talk about today. So I've been in Office around 6 years, and in Microsoft 10, and always involved in some type of developer story. So I'm really passionate about that. Before Microsoft, I used to be a developer. So I'm really excited to see all these investments coming out to the public now with 2013, and I hope you guys will enjoy them too. And with me, Keenan.
Hi, my name is Ken Newton. Probably most of you already met me at the prior session. You know, one thing as we get started, for you guys and the folks in the back, if you have a hard time hearing, there's plenty of seats up front, because we only got these front speakers up here. So if you want, just by all means come up here. So about me, I'm the product manager responsible for the Office and SharePoint developer audience. This two-part session, as Rolando mentioned, we're going to get deeper into the cloud app model. We've showed you in the what's new, what apps are all about. We showed you a little about the Visual Studio tooling in the store. So now you understand the concepts. So when you kind of go through the rest of this week, you'll have that foundation already set for you. With that, let's start with our agenda. First, we're going to do a quick introductory to apps. We're going to go into the anatomy of an app. So we're actually going to kind of break down what kind of makes an app work. We'll look into the manifest files specifically on the app for SharePoint part. We'll actually look to see what the app package creates, the components that are inside that app package itself. And then we'll talk a little bit about the app architecture as well. So real briefly, because I'm sure there's some people that haven't weren't in the earlier session, so I'm just going to make this real brief just to kind of explain it. From an Office and SharePoint standpoint, we see that these tools are obviously great productivity tools. There are two main platforms that are out there for doing collaborative solutions, doing day-to-day productivity, whether you're dealing with Excel spreadsheets, Word, or whatever that it may be. So the other side of the issue is that we have all this service and data that's out there. So with all this service and data, how do we manage, how do we control all this content and be able to grab it within our, and consume it within our productivity tools? It's always a challenge. And as I mentioned earlier, it's usually a copy-paste type of operation. But wouldn't it be great to have something that could actually solve that can provide a user experience, that can provide that glue for those specific scenarios that you leverage. For instance, like mobile devices. If you take a look at apps on a mobile device, well, apps are very scenario-focused. Typically, you don't find apps that are full-fledged solutions like SAP. You won't see SAP for the mobile anytime too soon. You might see a user interface to do specific functions for SAP, but you won't find something that's going to do everything that SAP can do, as an example. And apps for Office and SharePoint, we kind of see it to be kind of the same way. They're meant to be more about scenario-focused, interacting with services that you have within your organization. They could be services out in the cloud, such as Bing, Wikipedia, LinkedIn, or whatever it may be. Or they could be line of business solutions that you have that are using in-house, that maybe are custom-built, or like packages that are purchased, such as like maybe Charles Rivers, SAP as one, Dynamics as another. And then the last part of it is kind of the app catalog in the store. So it's great that we have these solutions there, but one of the key aspects is trying to discover the solutions and be able to effectively install them and leverage them within your organization. So this is where the app catalog, which is basically considered like a private store, and the actual Office and SharePoint stores, which are public, come into play in order to be able to find solutions very quickly and be able to download them.
So if you attended the keynote, you probably saw a lot of demos of different apps for Office, and you grasped some of the concepts behind this new app model. I want to spend some time before we go into more demos, talking a little bit about the core elements and the key goals that we had when we put together this app model. So I normally start asking who is or consider themselves a SharePoint developer, but I'm not going to ask that here because I know everyone here probably is a good SharePoint expert. But I'm going to ask you who, and I want to see hands, who of you consider yourselves to be an Office developer? And think about Office client developer. So there's a few people. Who of you consider yourselves a web developer, that you can do general web development, create websites, web pages? Okay, big majority of people. So the point of this new model is, first one, we want to unify. We want to unify the developer story that we have had. Historically, it's been a little bit fragmented in terms of the SharePoint developer doesn't consider himself or herself an Office developer and vice versa, right? It's really hard to know people that know VSTO and VBA as well as can do SharePoint, web ports, workflow, etc. So the different technologies that you need to learn are a little bit separated. One of the things that we want to this big model is bring this unification by adopting web standards and making the web really the place where Office and SharePoint come together. So the first thing is, with this new app model, you will see that at the center there's your app. So you're going to create apps, and as you saw, using HTML, JavaScript, but you can also do server-side logic and use any language of your choice as long as you render and produce the contents in a standard way using web technologies. So you have flexibility and choice of how you want to build your apps. Now the next thing is we created a safe and secure environment where this logic is running. On the client side, as you will see, all the logic that is running in the apps for Office, that's running in Excel, in Word, in Outlook, it's actually sandboxed in a browser environment that basically secures the app and makes sure that the user experience is protected. On the server side, you have seen we have different models, and the code is no longer running on SharePoint. The code is running on some other web server. It can be Azure, it can be your own web server, but we no longer have server-side code running in SharePoint. And I think this is great because we are actually not losing any of the rich interoperability. As you will see, SharePoint exposes a lot of APIs that allow you to still interact and take advantage of the full power of SharePoint without having to run your code in SharePoint. And that is thanks to the set of APIs. So both on the client side as well as on the server side, we expose a set of APIs that allow you to interoperate with both Office clients as well as SharePoint clients. You probably are already familiar with the CSOM, the REST APIs. We're probably going to have more sessions that go into detail of that. The point here is that SharePoint and Office are both exposed, and you can consume those APIs using web technologies, either JavaScript or server-side logic. And the idea here is that if you know how to do web development, you pretty much already know how to do apps for Office and apps for SharePoint. And hopefully by the end of this session, you will see how this is really becoming a reality for us. Of course, there is more beyond just the logic that you put inside your app. There is also third-party services, and there's a lot of devices that we want to integrate into your apps. So the APIs that we expose also specifically in the service side also allow you to integrate solutions that integrate into the phone, into the Windows 8 clients. So you can actually create solutions that go beyond just Office and SharePoint by integrating other types of clients as well as third-party services. And lastly, we have tools. So you will see some demos of the tools here, and there's dedicated sessions about the tooling, which I really recommend. Go see how Visual Studio and Visual Studio Napa, which is a browser-based tooling for developing apps for Office and SharePoint, allow you to do this very easily. But in the tooling space, not only you can use Visual Studio, you can actually use any tool of your choice. As long as the tool can produce HTML, JavaScript, and the type of web technology you can use, you can select that technology to build your app. So with that, I'm going to jump into the anatomy of an app for Office and basically go to the basics. I want to make sure that we understand what the basics, and then we start growing in complexity to see what is possible with the app model. So In the keynote, you saw an app is really something really simple. An app is a web page plus a manifest in its most simple form. And let me actually show you a few demos of that. So for this first demo, I'm going to use the simplest app, but I love this scenario because it's the canonical scenario that allows me to illustrate how with an app and with web technologies, you can actually integrate the power of the web into an Office client. So in this case, I'm going to start with an app for Office. I'm in Excel. I'm doing some research about the national parks in the US, and I have put that data in Excel in a pivot table. So I have put some nice graphics there, and I have a pivot table that allows me to slice the data by state and see all the parks by state. Now I'm going to come here and insert an app for Office. In this case, it's a Bing map. And of course, since this is geographical information, it makes sense to render it in a Bing map. So the first thing I want you to notice is that this Bing map is effectively a web page. I can actually, in the browser, go to this URL, and you can see how that is just a web page with a Bing map control. So nothing really fancy so far here. Now, one of the key things that we put into the model is the JavaScript APIs that allow you to interact with the Office document in this case. So I can do things like select the set of parks in New Mexico and click here, and the app has access to the content. And this is where we're starting to do the bridge between the web, which is a lot of mapping and cartography information coming from the web to my client, with the data that is in my document. So I'm effectively, in a couple of clicks, creating a mashup between data that is in my local machine with data that is coming from the cloud. And this concept is really powerful, and it's at the core of the app model. Now, I want to show you what's behind the scenes. So what is the difference between just this map being there and this map being an app and interacting with the Office document? So there's a couple of things that make this an app for Office. The first one is the manifest, and I'm going to very quickly show you that a manifest is a very simple XML description of how that web page integrates into Office. So you can see this is the actual manifest that I used for that Big Map example, and you can see there is, of course, an ID, a version, there is a provider name. The most important attribute here is the default value for the source location, which is basically the URL where that app is being loaded from. There's also a permission section that allows me as a developer to specify what capabilities I need in terms of interacting with, in this case, with the Office client. In the case of SharePoint, there's also a set of permissions that you can request if you want to read lists, create workflows, have administration privileges, etc. So the manifest is the first thing that I need. Now, the second thing is I want to interact with the Office client, so I can come here and do view source, and this is going to let me see the source behind that web page. I'm going to close this one in Notepad and show you that in Visual Studio so that we can get the nice coloring. And I want to highlight a few things here. The first one is, as you can see, this is just a regular HTML page with some JavaScript. The second one is I'm using several JavaScript libraries that I found on the web that are very useful for my development. I'm using jQuery. Of course, I'm using the Bing Map control that allows me to create the map. I'm using some libraries for my menus. And the most important one is here. I'm including the office.js, which is the file that gives me access to all the APIs that allow me to interact with the document. And that office.js file is going to be hosted on a CDN location so that all you need to do when you create your web page is point to that CDN location, and then you can start interacting with the document. And then from that point on, the rest of the code is really just JavaScript and HTML. 95% of the code in this application is really just driving the map, putting the pins, etc. And there's just a couple of lines, which I can show you, that are actually specific to Office. And this is one of them, the get selected data sync. This is one of the functions that allow me to read the selection. And the other one is this initialize function, which basically is the way, as a developer, I declare this is an app for Office, and I'm ready to start working against the document. So again, very simple concepts. I have a web page with HTML, JavaScript. I include my office.js, and I can start doing things like this Bing map.
So Rolando, can I ask you a quick question?
Definitely.
Okay, so I saw that you had you created that context object. So would I have to do something different to do that same kind of thing if I were to treat like a table in Word? Or would it be or can I use that same code?
That is actually a great question, and we actually didn't prepare that question, but it's a great segue to the second point that I want to make, which is the API that we expose. One of the key things that we wanted to ensure is API compatibility. So today, for people that are familiar with the models that we have today in VSTO and COM, if you want to create an app for an app for Excel, you need to create an add-in for Excel, for example, or an add-in for Word. But if you want to share functionality, then you need to create and manage two projects. One of the key things that we care in the new model is about compatibility, not only across apps, but also across versions of Office, so that when we rev the platform, we rev the clients, your apps continue to work. So we built this API from the ground up and built in a lot of abstractions. And one of the things that you can do is something like this. So I'm going to jump and show you another example to illustrate this point. In this case, I'm in Word now, and I have this set of open issues in one of my specs. I'm going to bring an app for Office that allows me to do something simple but interesting. So this is a very simple app that I created, and it allows me to select any table in a Word document or in an Excel document and create a SharePoint list out of that. Isn't that useful? So I'm going to select that table. It's already selected. When you click this button to connect, now one of the things that I want to show you here is this app is hosted in Azure, in an Azure website, and it's going to connect to the SharePoint site using the URL that I provided in that text box. So I'm going to move the window there. So I want to create a list on that SharePoint site. How is that app going to be able to access and have permissions to write list on there? Well, this is where OAuth comes into place. So SharePoint supports OAuth as the mechanism to authenticate apps. So very similar to what you have seen in other platforms, you can actually trust that app. So I'm going to actually accept that that app can create a list on that SharePoint site. And then from that point on, the app has permissions to talk to that SharePoint site. So I'm going to come here and say, this is my issues list from Word, and leave the description blank, and I'm going to say create list. So this app, which is hosted in Azure, is now going to, using the trust that I gave it, connect to SharePoint and create me a list. And there it is, list created. I can actually come here and navigate to the newly created list. So you can see I, in a click, just transferred a list from Word, a table from Word to a list in SharePoint. So very powerful. Now, isn't that cool? Yeah, thank you. Now, to Keenan's question and to the point of API abstractions, this app not only works in Word, but I can also come here to my same Excel spreadsheet where I have the national park information and do a selection here and bring that exact same app. I'm going to bring SP Lister, and I want to show you same code base. It's going to do exactly the same thing for me. So I'm going to connect. And in this case, I need to trust the app again, and that's just because I didn't cache the token that I need to. But if I had cached the token, then this trust would have happened just once. So I'm going to trust this app. Now the app has, again, ability to show permissions. And I'm going to say issues list in Excel. And then same code base, and as expected, this is going to do the same thing. Now, thanks to the abstractions that we built into the API, you are not dealing with a Word table or an Excel table. You are dealing with a table object, and this table object is common across all these apps. And this allows you to do things like this. Something went wrong. I need to figure that out. Let's try. Okay, let's just give it one more try and see if that works. Let's just
give it a different name.
Yeah, Excel. And hopefully it will work this time.
Here we go.
There you go.
Doesn't like when you try to create another list when it exists.
There you go. So, and then if I navigate to that list that just got created, you can see, there's my Excel data in there. So again, second point, ability now to create apps that not only target one client, but that target many clients. And as you will see, this is true not necessarily just for Office, but you will see how you can reuse code across Office clients, but also from Office clients and SharePoint. So we're going to cover that in other sessions tomorrow. Let me continue, and I want to show you basically the development experience for this app. So a lot of these apps we created when we were creating the platform using very simple tools. I actually created one of the first apps using Notepad, and it actually wasn't that bad of an experience. Of course, we now have very powerful tools, and I want to show you that experience in Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is going to give you a very nice experience. It has project templates that allow you to create apps for Office. And I want to create a very simple app from scratch and show you the end-to-end life cycle of that app. So let's create a translation app. So I'm going to call it my SPC translator. And I want to run in all those apps, yes, and let Visual Studio take care of all the setting up for me. Now, as we saw, really the core elements that are being created here are an XML manifest that describes how the app integrates into those Office clients, and an HTML page. Of course, Visual Studio gives me a lot of additional things, like the initialize function with some sample data, and I'm going to just run this app just to see how it looks like. So very nice F5 experience, and this is a sample app that allows me to set some data. And I'm going to say set data. And I can get data. So very simple, right? Now, let's make something more interesting out of this app. Let's say I want to do a translator, as we said. So what I'm going to do here is replace the body of this HTML file with a couple of things that I need for my translator. So in this case, I'm just doing a button here with a translate function, and I'm going to have a div to receive the translation. That's all I'm doing, very simple change. And the other thing I want to do here is I'm going to replace the sample code that Visual Studio gave me with a function that allows me to translate. And I'm going to put a breakpoint here. So that function is actually also a very simple function, and is using the get selected data. All I'm doing is read the selection, and I'm going to do a web call to do that translation using the Bing Translator API. So I've hit F5, and this will run in Excel again. Now I can see my app, and I can put a word here. So I'm from Mexico, so I speak Spanish. I'm putting a word there, and I want to translate it. Of course, you can get the nice debugging experience, and you can see a lot of these experiences in the sessions for tooling tomorrow. But you can see how I can inspect the variable values. I can see the text that I'm translating, and then I'm going to let it run, and it's going to give me the translator. So I'm making a very simple web service call, do the translation, but I have a useful app already. And so with this, I want to stop here for a bit and then switch it to Keenan, which is going to show you the same concepts, but how they work in apps for SharePoint. Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and start off with just a blank SharePoint project, which I had. So we'll just go to File, New, and click Project. And we'll call this one SharePoint App 101. And we'll click OK. Now, as you saw with the Scott Guthrie keynote, we have the option of the name, where I'm going to be deploying it to. But as opposed to auto-hosted, this time I'm going to create a SharePoint-hosted app. And the SharePoint-hosted app is actually a special type of app where there's actually no code, and I say like server-side code, associated with it. It is strictly HTML and JavaScript. And it is actually an app that is deployed the HTML and JavaScript content is deployed into SharePoint, and SharePoint will host that for you. So now that we went ahead and created that project, what you'll see in here is that I have like things that look like a typical normal project. I have my features, I have packages, things that we're all very much used to. And I can very much create SharePoint content. I can add a web part that pre-exists. So if I want to add the list view web part into my app, I can absolutely do that. If I want to create an event receiver, well, I don't create like a typical event receiver. I create something unique called a remote event receiver, which is basically an event receiver that's defined declaratively, and it sends an HTTP call to some service. And we'll have part two should after this we'll go into more depth there. But I can build these artifacts and build these pages just how I kind of built them before. The one caveat is, of course, I can't have server-side code. Now, with provider and auto-hosted apps, with those style apps, I can still do these things within my SharePoint project. When I want to create that web part and create that content, I would just make sure that it's defined within, those pages are defined within the SharePoint project. And I can fully leverage that and all that content that I can create. So let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is we'll start off with, we're going to add a button here. And we will go ahead and call it, let's see here. Oh, there we go. So here I'll just add a button that's going to get me a list of counts. Pretty simple, nothing overly too exciting. But what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add a little bit of JavaScript in the code behind here. And as you can see, I already have references to jQuery, which are embedded with the Visual Studio project. Visual Studio will also, when you do deploys, will also, if you have it switched on, will leverage the CDN network for you as well. And what I can do is, once I have this, I can go ahead and we'll add a function here at the end. And we'll call this, this will be the SPC number of lists. This is the one that's actually going to do the work for us. And it's going to go ahead and get the web properties, and it's going to go execute this function and just return an alert box with the number of items in a list. And whether it's if something goes wrong, it'll go ahead and return that on failure. And within my ready function itself, I will go ahead after the get user. I will go ahead and add the some ready content to make sure that we're all set and ready to go. So this will go ahead and wire up that button for us. So go ahead and fire the get properties event and stop the default action of that particular button. So pretty much all great JavaScript kind of stuff that's here. One thing I just noticed that would catch me very badly if I didn't fix this. So the context is renamed here. So just make sure we give it the right name. And when I go ahead and we'll go ahead and hit F5. And what it's doing now is packaging up the app. Now, unlike Office, Office uses an XML manifest, and that's pretty much all that gets deployed into Office. But in case of SharePoint, we actually create a zip file with not only the app manifest, but the actual content itself that's associated with your app for SharePoint. So it's going ahead and uploading the app.
One of the things I want you to notice, basically the development experience is very similar across the two environments. You are doing HTML and JavaScript, and in the case of SharePoint, in this case, you're using the JavaScript SharePoint OM that allows you to connect back to the SharePoint server, all from the client side. So the experience, again, is very similar. If you are familiar with web pages, and you can use, again, here, Keenan is using jQuery. I'm using jQuery too. So, I mean, all this knowledge and all these libraries that you use for your development, you can now start reusing across the board.
Okay, so it took about 30 seconds to install the app, that's pretty typical. That's what you would typically see in environments. So hopefully they're starting to solve our networking issues that we have. And it's going to bring up the web page for me. And I can go ahead and I should have a button on there. And if I click on the button, I'll be able to go ahead and add, receive the number of lists that are currently existing. Let's go ahead and hit refresh. I think we're having a little bit more success. Okay, so here we saw the hello world that I had there, get counts of lists in the web, and number of lists is 2. So that's great, that's fine, that's great. But what about that SharePoint content that I was actually talking about? So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can just go ahead and add a list, just like how you would do it today with SharePoint. I'm just going to go ahead and go to Add, New Item. We're going to SharePoint List. We're going to call this list Test Custom List. I'm going to add it. And it's going ahead and it's going to ask me what type of, how I want to create the list. I want to make a default. We'll just use the defaults here. Name is fine. Click Finish. And once we're done communicating with SharePoint,
now one of the key things here is that this is all connecting to the Office 365 environment. So one of the key things that we have now from a tooling perspective is you no longer need to have SharePoint server installed on your development machine if you don't want to. You can now do remote development where you have your client machine with Visual Studio and that is connecting to your Office 365 dev tenant account, for example. And you can sign up for free today for a dev tenant and start doing this type of development today.
Just give it a few more. We're just going to cancel. I know we don't want to switch to offline mode. Nope. Don't need that. Click OK. Yep, got it. And so we should have everything here. So just like if we look in the project itself, here's my test list itself. Here's the instance itself. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is, as opposed to showing this the list itself, what we're going to do is we're going to add the list view right to the web page itself. And with that list view, we should be able to grab that list and show it within the app itself. So right here, I have a notepad file right here where I have my web part. And we'll just go ahead and paste that right there. So here's my web part itself. Again, standard SharePoint stuff that we've all seen before. That's all there. And we'll also go ahead and, while we're doing it, so we don't have to wait for the F5 again, we're going to add a new custom action. Now with a custom action, I can actually call web URLs with the app model. So we'll just go New Item, and we'll go ahead and add a new menu item. And what it's doing right now is it's discovering the information about my SharePoint site. Tell me where I want it. Now we'll just keep this really easy. We're just going to put this into the app web itself. We are going to scope it to the list template, but I could scope it, to the list instance itself, or to the content type, or the file extension. So actually, we'll go ahead and just send it to the list instance. Communicate with SharePoint. It says, okay, I got the list instance. SharePoint App 101. Click Next. What's the menu item itself? We're going to change this to Go to Bing. And as opposed to going to the default page, we're just going to tell it to go straight to go to bing.com. And we click Finish. So once we finish that, we've created custom action. We've created some SharePoint declarative content there. We've created a new list. Let's go ahead and try this F5 deployment. And let's take a look at that content on that page. So again, what it's going to do, it's going to uninstall the app for me automatically in Visual Studio. It'll go ahead and start, once it's done uninstalling, it'll go ahead and start the installation process, which should take about 20 to 30 seconds for us, and then bring up a web page. So let's see where we're at here. In 20 to 30 seconds is actually pretty typical for the deployment itself. Just waiting here. See, we're at 6 seconds for the installation. So in about 20 more, we'll be ready to go.
Now, in this case, since we're deploying to SharePoint, SharePoint is basically serving as the host for this code. So again, as Keenan said, he selected a SharePoint hosted app, so there is no server-side logic running in this application. It's all client-side. But you can do things like declarative custom actions. You can do the immersive full app experience, and you can also include app parts. So you can actually mix and match all these things to create your SharePoint solution, as well as to add any of the SharePoint goodness that Visual Studio allows you to do, like workflows, lists, content types, document library, even like BCS connections to external data. You can package all that into your solution, and as long as there's no server-side logic, you can have it as a SharePoint hosted app. And the benefit of that is that you don't need to have your own web server to host any server-side logic, right? Of course, there's benefits of having server-side logic that we're going to talk a little bit more about later in this session, but SharePoint hosted apps are a really easy way to just have a package, deploy it to SharePoint, and don't worry about where do I put my code.
Okay, so as the page is just loading right now, so just give it a second while that loads. So like we had the button before, here's my list. I can treat a list like a normal list with the list view web part. I can go in there and say new item, and we'll go ahead and add some type of content in there. We'll just put in the word hello, and click save. And again, this is stuff I can do with an app for SharePoint. I can do all this content that I have. So it isn't like you have to go wire up all the SharePoint stuff that you normally would do. You can use that right within an app for SharePoint. And there the list view web part is actually showing it itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at the menu item here. And you can see down here I have go to Bing. I click on that. That was a custom action I created called go to Bing. And there it is, I go to Bing.com. So I can do all this stuff that we all know and love that we already do, just the code now isn't executing in SharePoint, it's executing somewhere else. So let's take a look at inside what this package actually looks like. So if I go ahead, and this is the app itself, this WAPP session. You'll notice some things that are interesting in this folder. Now this folder is under my bin debug directory. You notice that there's a WSP, and sure enough, that's a SharePoint solution. But I can tell you that what's not in there, you will not find anything with the letters DLL anywhere in there. It is nothing but declarative code. So that's the key thing to know what's inside that SharePoint solution. But the app itself is going to contain all the bits that are associated with it. So what we'll do is we will open up this app package. Unlike the WSP, it's very easy to open up an app package. We just change the extension to zip. Yes, we know. And we open it up, and there's all my content in here. So first, let's take a look at the WSP file in here. We can see that that's in there. But the other key thing, other bits of content, is like the app icon itself. That isn't part of SharePoint solution. That app icon is actually stored within SharePoint itself. So when I go ahead and have that app icon show up on where my apps are, it'll show up there in the right location. So, but let's take a look at the app manifest. We'll just increase the font just a little bit. Okay. So the app manifest is pretty simple. If you notice, it looks a lot similar to the Office manifest, right? So here I have some basic properties, and the first one tells me is start page. And start page has a little interesting thing at the end called, within the brackets, the squiggly brackets, called standard tokens. And that actually sends information to my page about the SharePoint site itself. For instance, it will tell you where the SharePoint host URL is. So where did this request originate from? This is probably not so much important for an app for SharePoint, a SharePoint hosted app, but for auto-hosted and provider-hosted, when you're going onto a separate server, that little back button needs to know what it is going back to. So that's how we actually pass along. So we insert that Chrome control. That Chrome control is actually looking for that in the query string itself. Another key thing, when we're doing the development, you'll notice that the app principal is set to internal. This is for when you're doing F5 with apps for SharePoint. It's automatically set to internal, so you don't have to worry about OAuth and authentication. The assumption is that you just approve it. You can never submit something like this to the store, and you should never, ever submit something like this privately within your own app catalog, because you want to make sure that the things that you create are interacting properly. Now, if I had to have permissions, I could very easily, I would have permissions in here, like tell me if I wanted access to a list, or if I wanted access to to the web or to the site collection, you define all those permissions. So that way when a person looks at your app, you see that little trust button saying, do you trust it? That list of stuff that comes up there, whether what it wants to do, it's all being driven from this XML file. So let's go ahead and close that. And we'll go ahead and jump back to our deck. So to recap, just kind of what I briefly talked about. First of all, from the we showed that you can use we just used lists and we used custom actions and we used some of the web parts that SharePoint has to offer. But I can use workflow, BCS. I can define external content types declaratively. I can define event receivers, specifically remote event receivers. All this stuff that I do with a normal full trust SharePoint solution can do all with an app for SharePoint. Another key thing is the different types of shapes. So the type of shapes that we've shown so far have been the immersive, like the full shape. I showed you a custom action, which was a basic menu item that went to something else. In the last session, we actually, with Serial, we actually showed an app part that actually, with the carousel app itself, and that's kind of synonymous to a web part. App isolation. If you notice that the apps, like the auto-hosted apps and the provider-hosted apps, those are all running in a different URL. But if you actually looked at the SharePoint-hosted app itself, the SharePoint-hosted app is actually running in a separate URL as well. So if we take a look at the, oh, not that one. Thank you. If we take a look at the, let's see, where am I here? At the actual app itself, so if we go to site collection and we open up the dev site itself, that app that I deployed will be there. That's available to, that should be there to what I had created. So I go to site contents, and you know what, I think when I shut down, when I stopped debugging, it might have rolled it back for me automatically. Well, what I wanted to show you was that the actual, the app itself will have a different URL. So it actually creates a separate web app for you, a SharePoint web app. And that URL is actually on a different domain than the actual domain that you actually have for the rest of your SharePoint site. And that's done intentionally to prevent things like cross-site scripting. So that way you can't actually try hacking into the SharePoint site itself without having the, without actually using like the, we do support like a proxy, proxy for making remote requests, but also without being able to do it without using OAuth. So a few more seconds here, and when the page comes up, then we'll be able to see that it's actually different than the actual domain itself. And it should come up in just a few more seconds. A few more. You can do it. I got faith in you.
Now, this app isolation is definitely one of the key aspects of the platform. Security at front of everything. Both on the SharePoint side, we're doing this app isolation by domain. On the Office client side, we have a similar approach where all the code is running on a sandbox, so the apps don't really have access to anything on the local machine. They can access resources on the same domain, and the browser is protecting the data so that it is not, the app is not actually just sending data to any random domain, but the browser enforces the same origin policy that basically doesn't let an app talk to a domain different from the one that it came from.
So as you can see here, the actual domain is actually different because it inserts a GUID into the app for SharePoint. So it created a separate web app, but it's different than the actual dev tenant that I was already actually using. So it's a separate domain. Again, this is all there. It's intentional. It does make you have to think about using like proxies, but SharePoint actually provides a proxy for you for accessing things like in the host web itself. So it's not impossible to get to, but in order to get to that information, that's when it has to use OAuth, and you have to set the site permissions properly as well. Again, it's just there to prevent having to hack the page. And last is the robust API set. We focused a lot so far on the client-side object model because that's what most of you probably use. I mean, When you're using sandbox solutions, typically you're doing client-side object model type stuff. You might use listData.service, but usually not too often. We also have a full set of REST APIs that are now available that we'll be talking to in a little bit about how you can leverage those. But if you're used to REST, you can go ahead and use this platform. Now, as SharePoint developers, we're very used to the client-side object model, and it's stuff that we have used on a regular basis. But to non-SharePoint developers, the client-side object model can be very foreign. Well, REST is a great entry point for them because they don't need to understand, and for lack of better words, the SharePoint isms, like context and things like that. They can just make a simple REST call and be able to interact with SharePoint directly. So kind of go over a little bit about the tools to kind of repeat. Again, it's all about your option of what you want to use. Obviously, Visual Studio is a first-in-class experience, but also you could use Notepad if you really want to, Ultra Edit, really any tool of your choice. As you saw, the app package was just a zip file with APP, and the app manifest was just an XML file. You could do all this yourself with Notepad and zip it up, call it .app, and you've created your own app. The Visual Studio experience, obviously, with the project templates, the productivity features obviously simplify a lot of things and make you more productive. But in the end, it's all about using the open web standards to creating great-looking apps. Using CSS, using XML for like the app manifest, being able to leverage templates within your code.
So now we have talked about the core concepts that make up an app. We have seen a little bit of the development experience, and hopefully throughout the week you will see a little bit more of details in the sessions that go into the deep dives of the APIs and the isolation models and the authentication mechanisms. Let me talk a little bit about the deployment model, because this is another big investment that we put in the platform to really simplify the life cycle of the app. So let's say I'm a developer, I'm done with my app. Now, how do I get it into end users' hands? So in this diagram, I just want to show you the big picture of the life cycle of an app. Once you have your app, regardless of whether it's an app for Office or an app for SharePoint, or a combination of both, which we're going to see that it's also possible, you get that app. And in the case of apps for Office, we support a lighter weight mechanism in which you only need the XML. In the case of apps for SharePoint, or apps for SharePoint that include apps for Office, you actually generate that .app package that Keenan showed you, which is a zip file that includes the manifest plus additional artifacts that SharePoint needs to do its work. So regardless of whether you're doing just an XML manifest for a simple app for Office or a full .app package that includes a lot of SharePoint goodness, you take that and you deploy it to what we call a catalog. And this is one of the key concepts of the new platform as well. This catalog-based deployment, which allows administrators to really have full control over the apps. So instead of having to manage all the different endpoints and clients where these apps can be installed, there is a single choke point, which is the Office Store in the case of the global catalog that we have for all the consumers, or we have private app catalogs. Basically, SharePoint has this notion of a SharePoint-based catalog, which is essentially a SharePoint list, which has a collection of XML manifests for all the apps. So once you have that app and publish it to the catalog, automatically all your users will be able to access that app. In this diagram, I also have this dotted connection to the web server, because as you saw, in the case, for example, of the Bing Map app, I was hosting that in Web Azure. And in some cases, you will need to do the deployment of your web logic to your own web server yourself. It all depends on what model you will choose. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The key point here is, again, this central location. I just deploy the app manifest or the .app package to this central catalog, and I can get my app in the hands of the user. So let's see a demo of that. So let's continue with my translator example. So I finish my app. Let's say I'm happy with my translator, and now I want to deploy it to end users. So I've been doing F5, and it's been running on my local IIS, but now I want to deploy it for real. Now, one of the things I want to do is I want to show you how easy it is to do it if you use Azure websites. So This is the portal for Azure. I have a free account right now, and I created an Azure website. Very simple, just a couple of minutes process. One of the key things that I can do in Azure is come here to the configuration of my website and get access to the profile that allows me to configure Visual Studio to publish to that website. So let's give it a couple of minutes or hopefully not minutes, but seconds.
And granted, do realize we're still having the internet gremlins right now, so.
Okay, let's try again. So basically, Azure gives me a configuration file that I can download and import in Visual Studio that allows me to very easily publish my app to Windows Azure. And that's what I'm trying to do here. Let me use one that I already have since Azure is being slow. So I'm going to go to my translator project. And in order to publish this app, I'm going to right-click on this project and say Publish. And I can import a profile here. And I already have downloaded that profile file. In this case, it's this Azure Websites connection settings file. I'm going to open that. That's going to have all the information that Azure already pre-configured for me when I created the website. That was just a very simple download. And now I can say I want to host this in Translator Subweb. And click Next. And I'm going to say Publish. So that's all I need to do. Visual Studio is going to automatically deploy my translator app to that website. And once it is there, the only other thing that I need is how my Office clients are going to learn about it. So I need to take the manifest and then deploy it to an app catalog, which is what we talked about. And the Office clients are the ones that are configured to look at that app catalog, see what apps are installed there, and then show them to the user. So that's the other thing that I'm going to do while this is running. It's almost done. So, still not ready. All right, the network's very slow today. I'm going to have to skip this part of the demo. It's going to take very long. What I wanted to show you is one that is deployed to Azure. Is basically just a web page there. I can go and also obtain the manifest from the Visual Studio project doing a similar publish gesture on my Visual Studio site. And then I come here, and this is a SharePoint app catalog where you can see you can have apps for Office and apps for SharePoint. And if you go to the apps for Office section, you will see that it's just a list of XML files. So again, right now the network is very slow, so I won't be able to show that either, apparently. But what I do is basically I upload the XML file to this list, and once it is there, then I can come back here to my client, and it will automatically appear on my insertion experience. So this insertion dialog, I have a tab for my organization. Basically what it does, it connects to that SharePoint list, lists all the XML files, and shows me all the apps that are already there. So once the manifest is published, I will get it here. Okay, and I'm going to go back to the slides. So unfortunately, I couldn't show that live because of the network, but the concept is very simple. Deploy your app package or your app manifest to the catalog, and your users automatically get it. Once it's in the catalog, the administrator can actually control the life cycle. They can release updates. They can actually uninstall the apps right in the catalog. Now let's talk a little bit about the different hosting models. So you actually saw a bit of a combination of different hosting models, so I want to explain this. We support 3 different hosting models for apps for SharePoint and apps for Office. The first one is what we call provider-hosted. And provider-hosted means you bring your own web server, your own hosting infrastructure. You put all your web artifacts there, including server-side logic and client-side HTML pages. You host them there. And all you need to do is deploy this manifest or app package to SharePoint and Office that points to your infrastructure, but your code is running in your own web server. That's provider-hosted. Now, we have SharePoint hosted, which is the other extreme. Everything is running in SharePoint. SharePoint is basically the web host. There is no server-side logic again, but you can do the hosting of any SharePoint declarative artifacts, including workflow, lists, content types, etc., plus any client-side code that interacts via REST or via CSOM to SharePoint. That's SharePoint hosted. And then we have this other model, which is, in my opinion, the most interesting one, which is called auto-hosted, which is basically the one that allows you to have both client-side logic, server-side logic, and not having to worry about the hosting yourselves. Because all you do is, basically, you put everything in that .app package, including the stuff that you want to run server-side, and SharePoint is going to automatically deploy it to Windows Azure for you. So completely transparent. You just create one package, and everything gets into the right places and executes from there. So these 2 models apply both for apps for Office and apps for SharePoint. You can mix and match and basically select the model that works best for your scenario. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit. We talked about the surroundings of the model, like what is outside the app. Now let's drill a little bit into what is going to be the typical architecture of an app and what can different apps do and how do you mix and match SharePoint and Office. The first thing I want to show you and I want to talk about is this model is all about bringing web content, web services, and the richness that it's out there in terms of social, connectivity, intelligence, all that goodness, bring it into Office. So the key focus and the sweet spot for the apps that you create here is when you connect to services. And these services can be on the cloud or can be on premises. It could be services on the Microsoft stack like other SharePoint and Office 365 services, but it could also be third-party services. And just to make the point, I want to show you a demo that I like that I think illustrates this concept really well. So I'm going to switch to my demo machine here and bring up this cost of living slide. You probably saw this demo where Cyril showed how to map this data. Now, let's see I'm doing analysis, and to the point of the intelligence and bringing the web into Office, what else can I do, or what can the web do for me when I'm working in my Office clients in this case? So I created a simple app that I call Magic Fill. I'm going to bring it up here. And this app is very simple in its implementation, but very powerful because it leverages a very powerful service that I didn't have to create. It was already there. So in this case, let's say I want to move to a different location, and I'm analyzing this data in Excel. And let's say for whatever reason I need some strange data that is not very easy to obtain. And in this case, I have found a very powerful engine, Wolfram Alpha, that allows me to make queries. And this is a knowledge engine that goes and crawls the web and collects all this knowledge, and it's already there on the web. Why can't we tap into that knowledge here in Office? And that's what I want to show you how to do. So I built this simple app that allows me to select a table. And let's say I want to move to a state, and for some weird reason, since I'm Mexican, I want to know the Mexican population in that particular state. That's something that I care about. So I'm going to create a new column through this app, and I'm going to express a natural language query, like Mexican population of. And I'm going to select one column that I want to use as the basis for this, and then click Add Column. Now, this app is going to connect to a very powerful service and do all the hard work for me. The app itself is really simple, but you can see how it's, in a couple of clicks, saving me a lot of work that otherwise would have taken me probably several hours of research and bringing this data into the Excel spreadsheet. So again, the point is the sweet spot for this new app model is when you connect to all those services. And this is just a very simple example, but imagine what you can do for your enterprise solutions, connecting to the CRM data, to the ERPs. Everything that you have in your enterprise can be shared and can be integrated into the Office because now that it's very easy to integrate with web standards, you can integrate all these systems that already exist and expose this information. So, and then I want to talk about, we saw a couple of examples and development of apps for Office and apps for SharePoint, but we talked at the beginning that one of the key goals of this new model is to bring the different worlds together and allow you to really, as a developer, tap on the power of the full Office suite and not just the individual products. So let me show you a couple of examples of how we're doing this with the new model. The first one is the concept of a document template. So a document template, in my opinion, is a very powerful concept because it allows end users to actually compose mini solutions for very specific long-tail scenarios that otherwise wouldn't be possible for different ISV. And let me show you an example of that. So I'm going to switch back to my demo machine. And open this dashboard. So in this case, it is a very domain-specific scenario. It's research about earthquakes. So this is a solution that definitely a company like Microsoft probably wouldn't target because it's very specific. But there are many people that care about these type of scenarios. Now, in this case, I want to show you how easy it is for an end user to, through apps for Office, solve their scenarios. In this case, I'm going to bring this earthquakes map, which is very similar, a very simple map like the one that we saw at the beginning. And I'm going to select this data and tell the map to map that data for me. Now, this data I enter myself, and I already using some pivot charts and pivot tables to analyze it. But I would like to get this data live and get real-time data for earthquakes. So there's this other app that may have been created by the same developer or other developer that does that for me. And the power here is through the document. These apps may not know about each other, but through the document, I can come here and with this task pane say, hey, find me the earthquakes that just happened in the last few days, and you can see how this task pane app just updated the set of earthquakes that just happened in today and yesterday, and I can now see that information in the map. I can do things also like select one of the earthquakes and get the Twitter feeds. Again, connecting out to the web services that already exist and bringing that information in one place to the user. But this is an app that the user composed itself by putting together two apps. Now, the key thing here is that now that these two apps are in this document, I can save this document and send it on email to any one of you, and you will get the same functionality. So this is a very powerful concept that we think is unique to our platform, where you can actually, as an end user, compose these mini scenarios and share them with people that care about the same scenario. So that is one powerful concept. Now, take that to the next level and then add not only several apps or several Office clients, but also Office and SharePoint. And then what you get is this much more powerful app architecture where you can actually put not only documents, Office documents with apps, but you can also add any of the SharePoint goodness like workflows, app parts, lists, document libraries, and then create an app package that includes all of that. So let me show you a quick example of an app that does that. So I'm going to come here to, this is an app for SharePoint that I already installed and deployed on my SharePoint site, and it's a blog publisher app. It has a couple of document libraries, it has lists, it has a workflow for the approvals, and it allows me to share documents and have them reviewed and approved. But this app also includes apps for Office in the same package. So when I deployed this app, everything was already integrated so that when I open this document, for example, in Word, there is a template of a Word document that allows me to continue the review process and keep my connection to SharePoint. So as you will see, the document that was stored in that SharePoint site comes along with this task pane app, which is part of the overall blog publishing scenario and allows me to continue doing my review. So in this case, this app connects to SharePoint and allows me to assign tasks, reviews. I can publish from here when I'm ready. I can add a new task and assign to people, and this will recognize, for example, all the users that you have in SharePoint. So you can see how this starts getting very interesting when you mix and match both documents, templates, app for Office, and all the good artifacts and functionality that you can achieve in SharePoint. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the power of the new platform. So again, very easy concepts, a web page and a manifest in its most simple case. But then you can start mixing and matching Office and SharePoint, as well as different hosting models, and then achieve all these great scenarios, and all run and are compatible with the cloud. Now, lastly, and just to wrap up, I want to show you kind of a real-world example of an app that we built that basically also uses all these concepts. We built this election tracker app for Excel that you may have seen in the keynote or the previous session. And this is an app, I'm going to actually show it to you very quickly, that we put together on the web to let people track the election. So we had this PredictWise service that had a lot of poll information that was very interesting to see how the different states change color. So in Excel, you can do things like see all the history. And again, forgive the slowness of the network here, but you can see how the different states changed color in time. Or maybe not. I think we're still having some network trouble. Well, the idea of this app is basically you can put it on the web. You can see it's running on the Excel web app. So one of the additional aspects of apps for Office, in this case, they run symmetrically on the rich clients as well as the web clients. But let me talk a little bit about some of the key considerations that we make when we build this app. So this is the architecture, very simple. There is a service that provides us the data. We hosted the app in Windows Azure, in an Azure website. So very simple from Visual Studio, we just published there. And then we put that app into a template, and we distributed the template to end users. Now, one of the key things that most of you will need to know or think about when developing apps is where are you going to host? So we talked about 3 different choices. You can do SharePoint hosted, auto-hosted, or provider hosted. So depending on your scenario, you may choose one or the other. In this case, we decided to do Azure websites because we needed to connect to the PredictWise site. And there was a couple of credentials that we needed to keep secret. So the only way to do that was to do it through the server. So if there is a secret or cross-domain access that you need to do in your app, you probably want to do some server-side logic to make sure that that information is protected. We follow the server-side proxy approach to achieve this cross-domain data access. Security and authentication is another important aspect that you need to consider. SSL is a hard requirement for publishing your apps, so make sure that when you create your app, you are aware of this. You will need to test your app, make sure that all the different resources that you load are over secure channels, otherwise the apps will not work correctly. One thing is reach. Take advantage of the symmetry that we're putting in this model and the ability to reuse code across Office clients and across SharePoint and Office. I mean, it's all web code, so you can very easily take a functionality that you put in an app for Office and package it and show it as a web part as an app part in SharePoint. And lastly, performance. There is a lot of client-side and server-side caching that we did in the case of Election Tracker to make sure that these web requests that are pulling the data, and you saw the network is very slow, but we try to do a lot of caching so that whenever the data makes it to the client, we actually don't do a lot of round trips. And again, if you're working with solutions that are distributed across the globe, this is going to be very important because you want to avoid those latencies. So, with that, I just want to wrap up. Of course, I want to open up. Do we have time for questions?
We do have like about 4 minutes for questions.
We have.
Yeah, okay. So all of you see the slide earlier. You're going to keep seeing it throughout the rest of our sessions. If you're thinking about building apps for Office, let us know. We have cards up here. There'll be cards over by the doors. We have a guy running out with cards. Kevin's running up here right now. So just raise your hand if you want a card if you're interested. We'll get back in touch with you, and if there's any support that we can give you, that we'll definitely do so. Check out dev.office.com. That's where you can get started. You can go to dev.office.com, create your own Office 365 tenancy, and get started building your own apps right away. Sign up yourself up with a seller account and start deploying apps into the apps in SharePoint stores.
Okay.
And with that, we'd like to thank everybody for coming. Please fill out your evaluations, and we'll take any questions you have. Thank you, and I'll see you in about half an hour. Thanks.